We're starting to see the impact of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs as they begin to hit the Canadian economy. Here's a look at some of the latest data points to underscore that. The unemployment rate in August ticked up to 7.1%.
President Trump's trade war with American allies. Tariffs on imported goods are now at their highest levels since the Great Depression. Mexican imports face 25% tariffs, while Canadian goods face 35%.
What if the real border crisis America faces isn't in the scorching deserts of the South, but in the cold, quiet forests of the North? What if the calm, friendly line that separates the U.S. from Canada is no longer as safe and unshakable as people thought? Right now, something is unfolding at the U.S.-Canada border that could change the balance of power between Washington and Ottawa. And here's the twist: while most of the media has been glued to the drama in Washington, almost nobody is talking about this. For decades, the northern border has been described as calm, uneventful, and almost boring compared to the chaos of the U.S.-Mexico line. But that's exactly why what's happening now is so shocking. Former President Donald Trump has quietly been moving chess pieces, making decisions, and pushing for changes that are putting enormous pressure on Canada. These aren't small adjustments. They're the kind of moves that challenge how the border works, who controls it, and what flows across it. And here's where the suspense kicks in. Canadian officials didn't see it coming. Neither did much of the press. Yet now, they're scrambling because the old assumptions about easy crossings and quiet cooperation are being ripped apart. The hidden front line. For months, the headlines screamed about caravans, walls, and chaos at the southern border. But while that story dominated TV screens, something very different was happening up north. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, but it was deliberate. Trump, in his usual way, didn't tiptoe around. He went straight for the core. To him, a border isn't just a line drawn on a map. It's a lever of power. Whoever controls that lever controls not just people and goods, but influence itself. And for years, Canada had the benefit of being treated as the easy neighbor. Those days Trump made clear are over. Tariffs and tensions. This shift didn't come out of nowhere. Tensions between Washington and Ottawa have been building for years, especially over trade and energy. Trump's tariff moves against Canadian goods sent shockwaves across the border. He justified them by pointing to fentanyl and other deadly substances supposedly slipping into the U.S. through Canada. Now, Canadian officials pushed back, pointing out that U.S. data shows less than 1% of fentanyl actually enters from their side. But Trump didn't seem to care about those percentages. His argument wasn't just about numbers, it was about control. By spotlighting Canada's role, however small, he forced Ottawa to respond. And respond they did, with new drug-sniffing dogs, drones patrolling quiet stretches of land, and more border officers in uniform than had been seen in years. Still, for Trump, these weren't just security tweaks. They were symbols proof that he could force Canada to act on America's terms. Caught off guard, Ottawa had gotten used to endless rounds of negotiations, joint press statements, and watered-down compromises. But Trump threw out that playbook. Instead of waiting for committees to shuffle paper, he hit directly at the weak spots. To him, the northern border wasn't a backdrop, was a battlefield for leverage. Washington insiders had whispered for months that Trump was planning something different with Canada, but no one expected the speed or the sharpness. Suddenly, what Canadians thought of as business as usual at the border turned into a pressure cooker, the core of the battle. This wasn't just about people crossing illegally, though. That was part of it. It was about something bigger: the networks of smuggling, the loopholes in trade, and the outdated agreements that quietly drained American jobs and profits. For decades, leaders treated these as separate problems. Trump tied them all together, turning the border into a single front in his larger fight for control. And when Trump draws a line, he doesn't step back just because Ottawa complains. That's why his approach stunned Canadian leaders. It wasn't polite, it wasn't subtle, it was direct and disruptive. Technology, patrols, and pressure. So what did this new approach look like? Not just a few extra patrol cars, not just some speeches about cooperation. Instead, Trump's plan pushed for advanced surveillance technology, drones sweeping across skies once thought to be quiet, and stricter inspections at crossings. Anyone coming into the U.S. from Canada now faced tougher scrutiny. The media tried to frame it as overreaction, insisting that the Canadian border was one of the safest in the world. But behind the scenes, Trump's team had been tracking the flows of drugs, weapons, and people for months. They had data, they had evidence, and they were using it to justify a crackdown. Ripple effects. The impact didn't stop at the border itself. Tariffs were stacking up, pouring billions into U.S. revenue. That money gave Trump more leverage he could use to demand reforms from Ottawa. Suddenly, Canada wasn't just worrying about border patrols. It was being forced to confront deeper issues like how to handle its aging population and the exploding costs of programs like old age security. But that's where the suspense deepens. Because this isn't just a border story. It's a story about economic strain, political pressure, and a quiet neighbor suddenly dragged into the spotlight of a much bigger power game. A quiet border, no more. For generations, Americans and Canadians thought of their border as an afterthought ease to cross, lightly guarded and rarely making headlines. That perception is being shattered. Trump's approach, whether one agrees with it or not, has already rewritten the rules. The northern border is no longer just a friendly handshake. It's a contested space where control, security, and sovereignty are all up for grabs. And that leaves us with a question that will hang in the air as this story unfolds. If the U.S.-Mexico border has been described as America's front door, is the U.S.-Canada line becoming the back door that no one can afford to ignore? Because if Trump has his way, that door is about to be locked, reinforced, and guarded like never before. What happens when political pressure turns into financial strain, and financial strain begins to shake the foundations of a nation's stability? That's exactly the question Canada is facing right now. The northern border battle isn't just about patrols and fences, any merits spilling into the economy, pensions, and even the way Ottawa cares for its aging population, and the force behind that pressure. Once again, Donald Trump, the tariff hammer. Every time tariffs were mentioned, critics rolled their eyes. They said it was political theater, a temporary tactic, or a bargaining chip. But what they didn't anticipate was just how much money those tariffs would generate for the U.S. Treasury, billions flowing in every single day. Trump wasted no time pointing to those numbers as proof that his strategy worked. For Ottawa, however, this wasn't just about math. Every dollar collected by Washington was a reminder of lost leverage. Canada's economy, tied tightly to U.S. trade, suddenly looked vulnerable. And the more vulnerable it looked, the more Trump could demand. The hidden cost of aging. Here's where things take a dramatic turn. With tariffs draining momentum from Canadian industries, tension shifted to another ticking time bomb: the cost of old age security. Already the largest expense in Canada's federal budget, it's projected to triple over the next few decades. By 2060, the government could be spending nearly $277 billion just on retirement pensions. Think about that for a moment, almost 3 times what the program costs today. Economists warned that this surge would crush younger generations with debt, while leaving fewer resources for education, healthcare, and infrastructure. A group called Generation Squeeze went public, urging Ottawa to ask wealthier seniors to delay collecting benefits. That idea landed like a shockwave. For a country proud of its social safety net, the thought of telling retirees to wait their turn seemed unthinkable. Yet the numbers painted a grim picture. And with Trump applying economic pressure from the outside, Ottawa's margin for error shrank even further. Trump's shadow over Canadian politics. What makes this story so fascinating is how Trump's border agenda rippled far beyond fences and patrol dogs. By tightening trade rules and enforcing tariffs, he forced Canadian leaders to confront problems they had long ignored. For years, officials reassured the public that the system was under control, that illegal crossings were rare, that drug trafficking was minimal, and that social programs could be sustained indefinitely. Trump's moves shattered that illusion. He pulled the curtain back, exposing weak spots in both border security and fiscal planning. And when those weak spots were exposed, Ottawa had no choice but to scramble for solutions. Enforcement and exposure. Border enforcement under Trump wasn't just about stopping drugs or weapons. It was also about exposing what had been hidden in plain sight. Reports of Canadian citizens detained by ICE were splashed across headlines, often framed as innocent people being unfairly targeted. But a closer look told a different story. Over 70% of those detained had criminal records. The rest were in the U.S. illegally. For Trump, these numbers weren't just statistics. They were ammunition. They proved his argument that the border was more porous and more problematic than Canadian officials wanted to admit. And the more the data came out, the harder it became for Ottawa to maintain the narrative of everything is under control. A stark contrast. The contrast between Canada's quiet, bureaucratic approach and Trump's aggressive enforcement couldn't have been sharper. One example stands out. Internal documents revealed that Ottawa spent over $170,000 of taxpayer money to repatriate 8 women and their children who had left Canada to support extremist groups overseas. Add in the transportation and personnel costs, and the total bill easily surpassed $200,000. To Canadian officials, it was framed as a humanitarian obligation. To Trump, it looked like weakness proof that Canada was willing to bend rules, spend taxpayer dollars, and quietly cover up decisions that didn't sit well with the public. This difference in philosophy, Canada's cautious management versus Trump's blunt enforcement, highlighted just how wide the gap had grown between the two neighbors. The hypocrisy problem. Meanwhile, across the aisle in Washington, Trump's critics were quick to attack his northern border push. Yet a strange irony lingered in the background. Many of those same critics had once voted for border fences, barriers, and enforcement measures. Old clips resurfaced of senators and presidents acknowledging that illegal immigration was wrong and that border security was essential. The hypocrisy was clear. When Trump pushed for enforcement, it was labeled extreme. When Democrats supported it years earlier, it was called responsible governance. Trump himself pointed this out again and again, hammering home the message that his critics weren't against border security, they were just against him. From optics to results, this is what separated Trump's approach from Ottawa's, and even from past U.S. administrations. He didn't care about optics. He didn't care about polite press conferences or vague promises. He cared about results. He had no problem breaking political norms to get them. Drone patrols, tariff leverage, stricter inspections. Each move might have been controversial on its own, but together, they formed a strategy that forced accountability. Canadian leaders could no longer pretend. They had to act. The beginning of a northern border revolution. So where does this leave us? The story at the US-Canada border isn't over, it's only just beginning. With economic pressure mounting, social programs straining, and border enforcement tightening, Canada finds itself facing challenges on multiple fronts. And Trump's influence, whether he's in office or not, continues to cast a long shadow over Ottawa's decisions. The northern border, once seen as a symbol of friendship and stability, is being reshaped into something much more contested. It's becoming a testing ground for policies, power plays, and political will. The suspenseful question is this: will Canada adapt quickly enough to withstand the pressure, or will the weight of tariffs, enforcement, and fiscal strain push it into crisis? And on the U.S. side, will Americans see these moves as protection or as the beginning of a much larger confrontation with their closest ally? One thing is certain: the days of treating the northern border as an afterthought are gone. Trump has made sure of that. The back door to America is no longer quiet, and the world is starting to take notice.